Hello, everyone, and welcome back to English Up, the podcast where we help you level up your English one topic at a time. I'm Alex.
And I'm Chloe, and today we're diving into something many of us do every single day, multitasking.
Exactly, Chloe, but is it really the superpower we think it is? We're going to look at what multitasking actually does to our brains and whether it's really a good thing.
So, buckle up. Let's get started.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is multitasking?
Well, in simple terms, multitasking is when you try to do two or more things at the same time. For example, answering emails while being on a conference call or texting while walking.
Right. It's essentially about juggling different tasks at once. But I've always wondered, how does our brain actually pull this off?
Well, our brain doesn't actually do multiple tasks simultaneously. Instead, it quickly switches back and forth between them. So, it's not true parallel processing. Think of it like a tennis player quickly moving between different balls. They're not hitting all the balls at the same time, but rather moving to hit them one by one.
That's a great analogy. So why has multitasking become such a big thing these days? I mean, it feels like everyone is trying to keep up with everything at once.
I think it's largely due to the demands of modern life. We're constantly bombarded with information and requests, and there's this pressure to be efficient and productive all the time. Plus, our smartphones have made it incredibly easy to switch between different tasks. It's like a never-ending cycle.
Absolutely. It almost feels like we're expected to take on more and more responsibilities, and multitasking seems like the only way to manage it all. But is it really? That's what we are going to explore further in part 2. But before that, let's have our quick vocab check.
Okay, so we used some interesting words and phrases in that first part. Let's break down 4 of them. First is
Juggling. This is a verb and it means to handle several activities or tasks at the same time, often with some difficulty. For example, she's juggling a full-time job and taking care of her family.
Next up, we have switch back and forth. This phrasal verb means to alternate between 2 or more things. It implies constant changes between tasks. So, for example, we could say, his attention kept switching back and forth between his emails and the presentation.
Then there is keep up with, another useful phrasal verb. This one means to stay at the same level or pace as something or someone else. Like in, it's hard to keep up with all the new technology.
And finally, we had take on, this also a phrasal verb. And this one means to accept responsibility for something. We used it when we said, we are expected to take on more responsibilities. For instance, don't take on too much work or you will get overwhelmed.
Now that we understand what multitasking is, let's talk about how it affects our brains.
Well, as we mentioned earlier, our brains aren't actually doing things simultaneously. It's more like rapidly shifting gears. And that constant switching is actually incredibly tiring for our brains.
I can imagine. It's probably why I feel exhausted after a day of multitasking. It's like a mental marathon.
Exactly. The constant switching requires a lot of mental effort, which can lead to mental fatigue and eventually burnout. And burnout is when you feel completely exhausted, both mentally and physically, from prolonged stress.
So it's a bit of a vicious cycle, isn't it? We try to do more to be more productive, but in the end, we're actually less productive because we're exhausted.
Exactly. And that's not all. Studies have shown that chronic multitasking can also lead to decreased concentration, memory problems, and even increased anxiety. So, it's really not something to take lightly.
Okay, now it's time for vocab check number 2, so let's look at a few more words and phrases we used just now.
First, we have shifting gears. This is an idiom, and it means to change quickly from one thing to another. For example, after the meeting, we had to shift gears and focus on the presentation.
Then we have take lightly. This means to treat something as unimportant, as in, don't take this problem lightly.
And finally, we have burnout, which means a state of physical or emotional exhaustion, often caused by prolonged stress. We could say, he suffered from burnout after working long hours for many months.
That's it for today's episode, everyone. It seems that multitasking is not all it's cracked up to be. It can actually be quite harmful for us.
Absolutely. So try to focus on one thing at a time and give your brain a break.
Don't forget to subscribe and share this episode with anyone who could use a little help in focusing. Join us next time on English Up.
Until then, keep practicing your English.